So first of all, Billy, welcome. Thank you so much for coming to the gallery to talk about your work with us. Can I start off by just thinking about the people, you were brought up in Smethwick, nearby Smethwick, and you've lived kind of in and around the Black Country for most of your growing up life in London now. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of the Black Country to you and about the people and the landscapes that have influenced you?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for being here on a Saturday afternoon, in Walsall, to listen to us speak. It's a real honour and a real privilege, and I'm very grateful. I think that Sandwell, really, specifically Sandwell, and I think for me it's inspiring because it's sort of my origin story. It's where I came into the world, and it's where my parents and their kinship folk first encountered Britain. It's where they began to be a part of the story of Britain being reimagined in terms of its colour palette and in terms of its psychology, really. And I think I've been very drawn to cracking the atom of the early 60s in Smethwick, really, and just the idea of 10,000 Empire workers coming to build a life, a new life, and transitioning from wherever they came from. For me, it's endlessly fascinating. All the conundrums, all the sort of epiphanies, those experiences, for me, catalysed in artistic form, is what sort of drives my practice, so.
Because you're mostly known as a filmmaker, aren't you?
Yeah.
And you've won many awards, and your films have been very kind of highly praised. And I think these kind of themes are quite constant throughout your work, aren't they?
Yeah, that's really generous of you to say. I think, I trained at the National Film and Television School. I did an MA there in 2008 to 2010. After making my first documentary in Lascelles about the race riots in 2005. Someone from the school saw my film and recommended that I apply there, and I'd never heard of the place. And I just landed, just randomly, really, from Smethwick to the National Film School. And then it really was random, and you're hanging out with really good craftspeople, talented people. Bless him, Brian Tofano died a couple of weeks ago. He was a cinematographer there, he took a real shine, and it really developed craft around lighting and set dressing and understanding, having the privilege to work in an environment where you can make your imagination a reality, And I did the documentary course there, and so that got me into the film, sort of, I guess, language or world. And then I found sort of the transition from film school into the industry of TV quite tricky, really. TV was very much about nullifying your identity and your authenticity, for the greater good of serving the public or wherever it, the logic was, And I felt very much like my individuality wasn't able to sort of flourish in that environment, so I started to apply to the Arts Council for grants, basically. And I got the first one to make a film called Year Zero Black Country, and it's an artist film with about 20 short stories collaged around the gift of finding over 100 hours of archive set in the 60s in the Black Country, which gave me sort of, for the first time, visual proof of the phenomenon of the newcomer. So I was able to sort of look at that and interview local people and make it a very original film, really, about the metabolism of that community. And that was my first foray into proper art, I would say, And that film got nominated for the Derek Jarman Artist Film Award, and it sort of got me started with the Arts Council. It's been a slow dance, but we've been making work fairly regularly with them, And I think The Exiles came from that. So all the research in that film, all the sort of privilege of having visual proof of what that time was like, was able to then parlay into fine art photography, So that's kind of how it began, really, And
I mean, the Exiles is really your first photographic series, isn't it? Because prior to this, it's been largely kind of filmmaking of different kinds. So, what were some of the things that prompted you to move into photography rather than film? And also, I know it's not that straightforward because you apply many filmic principles to your photographic work. So could you perhaps talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think I got started to get a bit pretentious, really, about time-based mediums like film. I started criticising time-based mediums, having to sit in a seat and just watch something. And I was like, well, photography is beautiful because it's a moment, it's an encounter, and the stories, on either side of it, there's a moment before, there's moments after, there's very infinite sort of readings that you can have from a photograph. So I liked that. That sort of piqued my interest. And then I sort of had a soft spot for artists like Gregory Crewdson and Stan Douglas and what they do with filmic principles in their photography. And I was like, no one in Britain seems to be doing that, or very few people. I think there's a woman called Julia Fullerton in London who does something similar. And I was like, well, I can do that, because I've got colleagues at the National Film School who can set dress, who can light, and I can find someone who can press, the camera, and I could just imagine the scene and build it, And so it became like that, and I think I wanted to make permanent artefacts, really, that plumb my psyche, they go into, like, my origin story, the story of my ancestors as I feel it in my bones, and that's how the sort of the creation of those photos came about, So it is a very personal, very deep thing for me, It's very much, it's not my actual memory, it's my bone memory. It's a different type of memory, It's really deep in me, and that's what I try to drag out for the photos, which I think gives it that sort of a certain glow or sheen, I think, because that's where the effort comes from.
It's interesting that you say that, the photography is a kind of moment in time, because we often think about it as that, but actually I really like that phrase, kind of single shot movies with regard to your work, because actually when you start to look into the works, there's actually so much going on and so many interlocking stories within there as well. I mean, Day Shift, for example, you kind of look in there and you've got so many little stories happening that you're trying to imagine what's happening with these things.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting, isn't it? I think, and I like the idea. That was a photo that was really well funded. So I was like,
that was the first, wasn't it? Day Shift was the first in the series.
So we had we had all the toys to play with, really. We had 3 days of access to the Black Country Living Museum, and the funding really to pay for people to come up from London, put them in hotels, and really sort of go to town on the location. So I was able to construct a scene that had 8 different stories in it. And a story like of a...
Can we put Day Shift? Yeah, Day Shift on.
There's a fella here who's drinking John Collis cough mixture, which was an opiate, A lot of people used to be addicted to that because they come from the Punjab and stuff, and they'd find that was a way to nullify whatever pain or that they would have, Here there's a couple of fellas who are beheading a swan with a machete, and they're cooking it, and my dad told me a story years ago, and his mates told me as well, that couple of guys came from the Punjab. And they didn't realise swans were protected by the Queen, so they'd go and shop them and flog the meat in the market in Smethwick, And I was like, I want to pay a homage to that story because it's a great story, And the swan, I think Victoria Park. But not this one. This is a taxidermy swan. This is
we didn't kill a swan. No swans were killed in the making of this work.
And we've got a fella up there. He's got a newspaper on his chest, and it says moon landing. Because the idea is this is the day that man landed on the moon. And the image is called Day Shift because people are going from night shift to day shift, So someone else, there's a guy called Alan Noir who's in there in the mirror, and he's off to work and this guy's off to bed, We've got some characters here watching cartoons, but they're sort of dead to the world, really, and not able to sort of see the fun of it. Here there's an encounter between an Irish woman and a young Asian man, and that's sort of a homage to how many Asian blokes in the 60s would have white girlfriends, really, and before they went, I guess, quote unquote native or whatever, and so that's an encounter there. And here you got fellas making moonshine, and singing Bhangra songs, and here there's a white woman who's sort of peering over at her neighbours, wondering, who are they and what is it that they've brought into this country, And here there's a woman who's received a letter, and it's a letter that's obviously she finds quite difficult to handle, And what happens with this image is the first image, and then in the next image is like seamstress, that's the same actress. So that story is continuing, across the series, and so a lot of work's gone into it, on a sort of imagining level, and what we tried to do was make this their private space and then have the sort of the ominous sort of world beyond that space. So you get a sense of the factories and you get a sense of the intensity of the location, So that was like a lot of the thought that went into it. But I remember spending like 8 months preparing this, 8 months for like a 2-day shooting period. Like it was really packed as an experience.
And I've seen, that you almost do these kind of mood boards and things like that, don't you? And collect kind of influences. So I know you've looked a lot at kind of historic photos of the time of the Black Country in the 1960s to try to get the detail right. And this is, for those of you with local knowledge, you'll probably guess that this is shot at the Black Country Living Museum, this particular one. So you were able to use that, weren't you? But, you know, as you said, you kind of looked at all these old photographs and films of the region, but also there are kind of paintings. The whole history of painting has been very influential
big
as
time.
well.
I think that with the Dutch guys, you know, from the 17th and 18th century, you know, their work, you know, the way they work with light, you know, the single candle as a light source, you know, and how it flourishes, how it can really make a space come alive, you know. They've got a real grasp on that. And so I've been looking at that with my cinematographer, thinking a bit about how the lighting can work, because there's lots of different lighting schemes going on there, you know. There's a fire in the cauldron on the right, you know, so there's a different type of light source. They're about to cook the swan, so they've got a different light source there, you know. So we've had to think a lot about that aspect, really, you know. And that's sort of the really... that's the sort of craft side of it, you know. That's the sort of fun stuff. Yeah, it's quite fun, that kind of stuff.
Right at the beginning, I mean, you've got a very clear sense of what you want that image to look like ultimately, and what stories to contain within the image, and then you'll go for it. So it's a very elaborate process, and potentially costly.
I think because it was my first photo, I didn't know what the rules were, you know. So I just wanted to make what I wanted to make, and I didn't really think about it, you know. But I realised afterwards that was a massive ball ache, really, you know, like enormous effort, you know, and we had a budget and we thought we could make 5 images with it. We ended up spending it all on just this one thing, you know. We finished the photo and I was like, where's the money gone? Like,
we've got one photo for
Can we make another one, you know? And then I had to wait 3 years to make any more, you know. I had to reapply at the Arts Council and go through that
and this whole project
process.
Was interrupted, like many projects were, by the pandemic, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Our conversation started way before the pandemic, and then of course the nature of this kind of work, Billy couldn't make these things during lockdown because, you know, they need so many people in close proximity.
So I end up just, like, you know, hanging out the Black Country Arms a lot, you know. Just
but then gathering more stories, because I think, you know, you describe yourself as an artist and a filmmaker, and a storyteller, which I find is really interesting, because it's not just your stories, it's the stories of your broader community, that you encapsulate them in order to kind of make visible a history that's really important for this region, the migration of many people from the colonies to come and work here in the Black Country, and the kind of lives that they made for themselves. And as you mentioned, it was the men initially who would come through, and the women and the families came a little bit later. And so there was this kind of weird kind of male-only community for a while, and which must have been very weird and very unsettling to come from parts of India and then to arrive in the Black Country, which is probably a very different landscape that people have experienced before. And I think in your work, you know, we can really get a sense of that kind of detachment, I suppose, that you know, you're really trying to kind of make your way in somewhere that's really quite alien to your experience.
Just what a profound experience for the retina, you know. Like, you go from being on the, you know, in the Shimla Hills, you know, living next to a sort of forest, and a clear day you can see the Himalayas, and then bang, you're in the Burmid, you know, and you're sort of being pulverised really on a soul level, you know. And I think that for me is really interesting. I mean, I grew up in quite a sort of chaotic family, you know, and there was always lots of stories around it, and lots of characters around, and lots of lives that were lived slightly out of balance, you know, and we bore witness to a lot of that. A lot of, like, humour and great, you know, spirited stories, but also lots of tragedy too, you know. Like, there's quite a lot of death, you know, young death, you know, and I think that's a sort of side of the experience that doesn't really get spoken about, because it's difficult to sort of traverse that terrain, you know. It's no one likes to talk about tragedy, you know, and so there's been a lot of that as well for me, you know. I think that the effect of the move on the psyche, you know, for me is really a powerful theme to continue to sort of mine, you know, for...
Yeah, I mean, it feels like that the psychology around it is very important to you. And of course, you've obviously talked to a lot of people who've experienced this at first hand and how that's made. But you've talked about the male community in particular, and kind of for this first wave of migration when it was very male dominant, and people were separated from the female members of their families, like their mothers or their wives or so on. What that must have felt like.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think not having access to the feminine side of your soul, you know, because you're in such a masculine sort of world, sort of full of bravado and I don't know, you know, like, and sort of like responsibility too, you know. it's sort of it's a sort of strange experience. It's not one that's documented very much either. You know, the idea that men came first and women came much later. That sort of is a recurring pattern in all the families that I grew up with. You know, so you have fathers who are very literate or more literate in Britishness than the mothers. You know, and the mothers arrive in Britain and immediately have babies, and quite soon after the kids end up outflanking their moms. You know, in terms of their literacy in Britishness. You know, but yeah, I think that original experience, I'm really drawn to the idea that like that there's an abandonment of the feminine that occurs as part of the package of the trip that people maybe aren't so aware of. You know, when they're set off and say, you know, shake their brother's hand on the farm and leave, they're not quite aware what's in store for them. You know, and I think that for me, that sort of that pivot point, you know, that precipice for me is very. Is where I like to luxuriate as an artist, you know, and just make that my realm, you know.
I think, shall we go on to one of the other images, because I think it's really interesting for you, you know, for everyone to hear about you talking about each of the images and what's actually going on there. So probably the next one. I mean, there are two that relate to work, because across the five of them, you've kind of got the domestic life, the work life, and the social life represented as well. And obviously there are overlaps between all of them. But yeah, if we maybe go to the Furnace Men, which is the one where they're outside the... Yeah, here we go.
This is from a story, an anecdote that I picked up from a local interview, with someone telling me that when they arrived, there was ballots done, you know, for the unions. And like none of the Asian guys could understand English, you know, and so they'd just sign X in a box, not really understanding. They'd all just assign it as a block, you know. And I wanted to sort of explore the idea that these men are sort of not receptive to this sort of white managerial figure, you know, who's speaking to them, and they kind of can't hear him. And I wanted to make that dissonance a sort of a feature in this particular image, you know. And I think, and that's how it came about, really. So we corralled, maybe a dozen young men, really, to play the roles of their fathers, you know, because they are all the characters in my photos. It's their story, really. It's their ancestry. It's the story of their fathers, the story of their mothers, you know. So they come and give it quite a lot of heft because they can enter psychologically the space that I'm trying to create, you know. So there's lots of marvellous performances here, and so that was sort of the concept. We originally were trying to go into a foundry, and we found a foundry in Lye called Vanguard that has the same forging techniques as what they had a century ago. And they're still the same, you know, and that's where we wanted to work, but due to health and safety, we couldn't get in there. So I had to sort of reimagine the scene, really, and we did it sort of so the idea is behind that door is the furnace, you know, but you don't see it, but you can almost feel it with the heat coming out the window. And these men are on their break and they're having a chat, and that's how the story unfolded, really, you know. Yeah.
And also, you mentioned with this one as well that, you know, the migrant workers were first of all kind of very segregated from the white workers, and that, you know, they're having their break, but they're kind of in a different part of the foundry. That, you know, I guess partly through language, if people were not able to communicate, but you know, also prejudice and.
The idea that people are cooking their chapatis on the furnace, you know, I like that, you know. And there's an image from a local photographer of guys sleeping in his wheelbarrow, you know. I like that, you know. I like the sort of the loose kinetic sort of energy that these men bring from their sort of rural upbringings in India into that space, you know. And when I found documentary footage of the Burmid, shot by a guy called Philip Donovan, you know, who's a sort of real patron saint of the black country, really, in terms of the documentaries that he's made. In the 60s, I found footage of the Burmid, and in the footage, it's like the Irish guys and the Asian guys and the Caribbean guys are doing the sort of the grunt work, you know, the hard yards, you know, without the masks, and then it's the sort of local managers who are sort of really nice and clean, you know, sort of guiding them. And when I saw that, I started to see layers of the experience of my father, you know, and his kin that I had never seen before, and that felt like a real privilege and also a real insight, really, into like. That point at which the encounter occurs between Britain and this other psychology, you know. I think the first encounter that the men would have had would have been very much like that. They're sort of quote-unquote second-class citizens, you know. They don't have full documents. They're only sort of half citizens, you know, and their experience of Britain maybe the beginning of it, you know, colours really the way the rest of it is seen, you know, and the way that information is transmitted through the generations, you know. So for me, it's really, like I say, that first kiss, you know, that first dance, that first moment is massive for me, you know, creatively to mine, you know. But
they're a massive performance, really, aren't they? You know, each one of them, and I love the fact, as you say, that, you know, yes, you work with actors, professional actors, but you also work with members of the community. And I love the fact that like second or third generation South Asians maybe, you know, just empathising a little bit with kind of what happened, you know, with the very different experiences of the people that first arrived from those that were born in Britain later on.
Well, I made a film for BBC Four a few years ago called Sikhs Asmedic, you know, and I got some really lovely emails, and it was people saying, oh, you know, like, my granddad came to the UK, you know, in the 50s, you know, and I'm now like, whatever, 20 years old or something, you know, and I've got my kids, you know, and people just like, they're able to sort of like go through the archive and all the visual proof of the early arrival stories. They were able to see their story, you know, and that was quite inspiring. That was inspiring to me, you know, and that documentary inspired the BBC show, Very British History. So they started to catalyse different communities' experiences through archive, you know, and so that became a thing, you know. But yeah, I think it is interesting that generational sort of ancestral line, and trying to use that as a sort of as a performative element, really, you know.
And can we go on to the seamstress, because we've got another image of work, a different image of work, and this one is dominated by a woman. I have to say this when we first saw this image, and of course your eye is drawn immediately to the very central character of the woman, and also the portrait of Guru Nanak, and it's very beautiful, that kind of dynamic between them, and the lighting is so special, the way that. And then I thought initially when I looked at it that she was the sole woman in the scene, she was all on her own. And I don't know if you've all seen that, but as soon as you start to look into that darkness, all these women start to emerge. These women who are kind of invisible, and that they're suddenly, so the more you look, the more they appear to you. And I just think that's so clever. And obviously that's entirely intentional from you. And this is your mom as well, isn't it?
So this is the woman from the window in the first picture in the centre role. My mum sat over here, you know. But all the women in the image have been sewing, working in the sewing factory for 30 odd years. You know, and this location is one of my dad's second cousins runs this place, you know. And the women have been working there that long, you know. So there's just literally, it's what they do and what they have done for a long time. So there's real, it felt like walking into a time warp, you know, that particular location, yeah.
So is this still
Still runs,
functioning?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. In West Bromwich, you know, just off the High Street, you know, but just behind the temple in West Bromwich High Street. So yeah, it runs there, you know. The fellow who owns it is like, he's on hard times, you know, because he's like, he gets the odd contract here and there for clothes, but he's on hard times. So these guys are almost like they're on call, really. Rather than working their day in, day out, because he doesn't have the contracts anymore, but the space is still there, you know. And we had to like move piles of clothes out of the room. It was all much more cluttered than this, you know, even though that's quite cluttered. But yeah, I'm really fond of this, you know. I think it speaks to the female experience more directly than all the other images, you know, and I think that there's something in that, you know. I think when I exhibited and people come to talk to me about the images, so often people have said, my mum used to work in a sewing factory, you know, but they kind of forgotten. It's like an old history, you know. So this brings that memory back, you know. So
yeah, and unless you've worked in that situation, you know, you don't see. It's invisible to us. We don't see. So it's really important to create images like this where, well, we can acknowledge that history.
Yeah.
Well, let's say there's not just history. It's still the same
present
now.
tense. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And can we move on to Payday? So that's the one in the bar, isn't it? So yeah, there we go. Because this is really interesting, because at first hand it looks like a kind of general bar scene of people kind of coming to have a drink after work, and imagine it's very hot, very uncomfortable work, so you would be quite thirsty at the end of the day. Do you want to just talk through this?
There's about a dozen Mickey Mouse pints set at the bar, you know, and the idea is that my dad always says, you know, that the factory workers, like, their throats would be so parched from the conditions of their work that they needed to go and have a drink, and Mickey Mouse was the one because it's smooth enough to neck, you know. And so I wanted to have that, and also the men created a banking system called the coup, which is the way they bought houses, you know, because they weren't able to get loans from the banks, you know. So I wanted to sort of have that in the image. So the men have got money on the table, and there's a sort of, if you look at the eyes of all the people, the guy on the left with the passport in his hand, the barmaid, and the guy on the right, they're all looking at the money, you know. And I wanted to make an image really where we sort of make money the subject, and this sort of novel way of creating a a loan system to buy houses, the subject, you know. So that's really how this image came about. I think the original, and you can see again that newspaper with the moon landing is on the right, you know. So there's details coming across all the images that sort of keep it sort of in time context. Yeah, and I think originally we wanted to film a photograph outside a pub on a vista and make it an external shot, but the pub that we found had been condemned in the time between getting the commission and then actually shooting the work. So we had to sort of go and move the camera inside, which gives a sort of very different sort of dynamic to, say, day shift, you know, because you're in an interior location and this space is a bit more confined. So we had to just get into the intensity of the performances, really, you know. So that's kind of some of the thinking behind the work, you know, and there's plenty more thought as well, but there's a sort of dispute here, and so the guy gets up, you know, and there's a dispute around the money. And I'm really interested in that sort of how money becomes your sort of your god, really, in a way, you know, when you come to Britain and you join the system, you know.
And it's an incredibly well choreographed scene because the dynamic between the different characters in it is incredible. You know, with the relationship of one to the other, and the way that they're also. Was it shot as one scene?
No, I wish I was that good, you know. Like, honestly, yeah. But no, we shot 800 plates for this, you know, or 900 plates, I think. It was just a lot of plates. And then I worked with a guy in Berlin called Nathan, who's a photo editor, you know, and it's almost like editing a film. We have lots of different performances and we start to sort of work out how they can speak to each other, and we really go deep into it. And we spend like, you know, 2 or 3 days on each image, just really interrogating all the performances and thinking, where's the best balance for this story? How can I strike the best balance? So there's a lot of decisions made here, you know, and the image could have been completely different, you know. We had the options, and I think that's the beauty of like this process, I think, and the edit, you know, treating it like a film, which is how I treat it, because that's my background, really, you know. But yeah, you know, amazing. The day that we shot there, actually, the woman who runs that pub, you know, she was on a game show at 4:30 on TV that she had won, and so we had to clear off by 4:30. So we were like really up against it, you know.
Yeah, the realities of life.
Yeah, the realities of life. Yeah. So we started shooting at 7 a.m. You know, it's like that early, you know. So yeah.
I bet. Shall we go to the final image, which is the canal side image, which probably is, you're probably not going to be able to get much detail from that, but you'll know which one we mean. It's of the canal boat coming down the canal, and of course no kind of looking at the Black Country would be complete without a kind of thinking about the canal, really. And of course we've got the canal basin just outside the gallery there with the canal system that links up the rest of Birmingham and the Black Country. So this is a really intriguing image, and also a technically very demanding image, because it's so black, it's so dark, you know, and you've got these really kind of pronounced moments with them that you've just picked out. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this image?
Yeah, I mean the canals in the Black Country are the stuff of folklore, aren't they? Really, it's where you're at your freest, really, when you're a kid. So I've got a really deep association with the canals. We used to live under the M5 motorway in Albury, and the back of the house went onto the canals, you know. So very close to me. And what I wanted to do was like almost use the canal as a sort of birthing canal, as a sort of metaphor, and that there's a sort of a rebirth occurs when people make the big journey, you know. And so they're on the one side of the bank, and there's a barge being pulled through, and these are men who've sort of been in some sort of fight. Some sort of skirmish. There's blood on their hands. There's a junni in one of the guy's hands, which is a sort of, you know, a Punjabi scarf, you know, if you like, you know. And the idea for me is that they're sort of this is where I'm going into that stuff about the feminine and the abandonment of the feminine. You know, that's kind of what this started to symbolise for me. You know, and I like the idea that it's almost like it's the edge of the experience of the factories. You know, it's a sort of the canals at night are sort of slightly mysterious, very mysterious location. You know. So that was some of the sort of thinking, and as I described the emotions that I wanted to elicit from my performers, they really understood what I was talking about. They really sort of got it on a primal level, and so they gave really exquisite performances. But again, as you say, it's a big black frame, you know, and so the performances are very small, aren't they, in the bottom right, you know. But that was some of the sort of thinking behind it, and I think with the whole series, I want to sort of make the landscapes a character of the Black Country, you know. I think that there's a vastness to it, an epicness to it, a sort of like a world, a sort of like, you know, it's operatic in a way, you know, and I think I want to sort of harness that and make that sort of a feature of all the photos I've yet to make, you know, but I'm going to make, you know, because I think, in a way, making the Black Country a beautiful place, a place of beautiful mystique, is what kind of, you know, that excites me, you know, and I think almost in a way replacing what you see with the naked eye with sort of an imagined, heightened sort of effort really is what I'm after, really, you know, to enter the sort of dream landscapes of the people of here, you know. But
so these 5 images are a start, really.
Yeah, just a start.
Aren't they? They're kind of, you have the ambition that you want to create many more images and build the series larger and larger,
I'm really
so that
hungry
you
for
can
it,
give a kind of a real sense of that history of the Black Country, which is so important.
Yeah, and I think the more money you get, like the better you can work with the lighting, you know, the more romantic you can be, you know, the greater the effect you can achieve, you know. So I'm really aiming to make more and more sort of, I say risky but ambitious images, you know. That is literally, I've got a sort of a Rolodex of concepts that I want to go and execute, you know. There's so many of them. So yeah, it's that long wait between the funding rounds, you know. But at the moment I'm penning a couple of sort of tightened concepts, because I think for me, the early 60s, if you use that as a petri dish to talk about today, it's very obvious that there's lots of echoes. So I think if I can continue to sort of plunder the 60s, but maybe speak to culture today, that's probably where like my practice will continue to grow and evolve, you know. So that's how I read it anyway. Yeah, you know, yeah.
I think that's a really good moment to kind of stop this element of the talk, and we'll go on to show Lumbu in a few seconds. We'll have some questions at the end, but are there any burning questions now while Kevin sets up for the film? And then and I'll also ask Billy to introduce Lumbu. And Lumbu, it's due to say, is a work in progress that's nearly there. It was shot in Karma. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Lumbu's a film funded by the BFI and BBC Films. So we got a BFI rep over here, and it's based on a short story I wrote about 6 or 7 years ago, which is like inspired by the community I grew up in. You know, I've been I'm really drawn to that sort of midway point of the migration story. So this is 60s photos, but also in the mid 90s when me and my friends were becoming adolescents and young men, and our families were sort of on the precipice of becoming more or less British, having sort of with that big transition. And I grew up in Albury, you know, and within 500 metres of our front door, there were so many stories, so many characters, so many dramas playing out, you know. And I've sort of tried to sort of commit a lot of those stories to paper, really, you know, or be inspired by them. And that's how this film was given birth, really, you know. And so, yeah, we shot a lot of it in Karma, because Karma still looks like it could be the 90s. And yeah, it was a big effort, actually. It was in January of last year. So a year ago we shot it, and we're still editing, because I've spent a lot of the last year working on other films, you know, with tighter deadlines. But yeah, it's a sort of work in progress. We haven't sort of mixed it, sound designed it, or done a colour grade. And we haven't got sign off from the BBC on the edit yet either.
Yeah.
So.
And we're, of course, not a cinematic venue as such, so you won't see it in the way that you might see it in a cinema.
This is not the official premiere.
But this is a privilege, though, because it's before it's kind of properly released and everything, and that we can share it. So.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, my background is more documentary and artist film, so this is my first foray into drama, you know, like quote unquote drama. You know, so this is my first effort at that, and it's sort of after this I'll be making a feature film. So.
Brilliant. Yeah. Oh well, let's. Are we? Okay? Yeah, we're okay to take Mark's lights off as well, and then. That's really beautiful. The performance of that young boy is incredible, because he says so little but says so much. At the same time.
Yeah. He's a non-actor. You know, he's someone we found at a local college. I cast for people who aren't actors, really. You know. But that's a very generous round of applause. Thank you. But yeah, it's nice to make something of the Black Country, in the Black Country, that echoes stories from my childhood. It's nice to do that. I've got quite a lot of material like that, you know. But yeah. Thank you for watching it. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to hand over for questions. Just to say, we are filming. We might not include the questions and answers, but obviously if you do ask a question and you don't want to be on camera, do let us know, because then we'll make sure that that's the case. So can we open it to questions? Anyone have a question they'd like to ask Billy?
I think 60 grand. Yeah, which is what it takes, isn't it, really, to make period stuff, you know.
It's probably not very much, is it,
No,
for film?
Honestly, it's diddly, because I work in docs a lot, you know, or I work with archive a lot. Like, you know, there's not much expense, but my expense, you know, and the camera or whatever, the edit, you know. But on this, everyone's being paid proper rates, you know, and you've got to shoot all your scenes in 5 days. There's a lot of like stuff to get your head around, you know, and shooting stuff out of sequence as well with non-actors. That's hard.
Yeah.
You know, because non-actors really should be filmed in sequence as the story unfolds, you know. But yeah, 60 grand. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, yeah.
I thought it'd been a lot more.
Oh, really? Yeah, yeah. No, thank you. I lived in Walsall for a year and a bit, so I got to know the areas, you know. So we found spots that I knew, you know, like behind the pretty bricks is where the garage is. That's, you know what I mean? It's a good pub.
But all the
interiors
interiors as well, and just the kind of period element of those.
Yeah,
do you
yeah.
just go? How do you put those together?
Yeah, the living room, that house, it belongs to. They've now passed away, but an elderly Hindu couple, you know, and their daughter looks after the house. But it hasn't really changed that much since the elderly people lived there. So we could walk into a time warp, you know. So it's useful, you know. But yeah, it looks right, doesn't it? It looks right.
No, it's really beautiful, and I just think the weight of that young boy, you know, just having so much responsibility and so much kind of emotional baggage that, you know, we all know that particular age anyway is somewhere you're still kind of navigating the world and trying to kind of work out who you are, and yeah, it just kind of really came through, I think, in that short film. It just really, very powerful.
Thank you. I don't know. I don't know. No, I don't know. Like it's a proper one.
It is a composite, though, isn't it? Day shift. It is kind of about 800 files that are working.
The detail and the contrast control and the rest of it.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, no, it's good, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, what we did was like, you know, we with my lighting team, we'd go and set up here and shoot that as a frame, you know. And then with my lighting team, I'll do the guy here. Then we run upstairs.
So is it a composite?
It is, yeah.
So you left the camera in one position?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
okay.
Up quite high up, you know, and then we had walkie-talkies and I would talk to him.
Yeah.
So, right, get that frame.
Brilliant.
You know, yeah.
Brilliant.
It's like that.
I was wondering how you managed to talk all those people into doing it.
Yeah, no, wouldn't that be amazing? You know, I'm not a miracle, like, you know. Yeah. So it's made like that, you know. But
beautiful stuff.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I really like the idea. I want all my pictures to be on that scale of, you know, bigness, you know. But then that necessitates budgets and stuff, you know, which takes ages to get your hands on, you know. So.
You happen to know what sort of print it is?
Oh God, you know probably more than I do.
What, these?
Yeah.
I can't remember.
C,
Yeah.
there you go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Like, I think that you put yourself under a ton of pressure, you know, to make sure you do it right, and there's a veracity to that time period. So I had elders from the community be present on the set so that they can say that that's authentic and you've done that right, you know. So that's important to me, to have that stamp of authenticity. But I think, yeah, you know, they're tender moments of emotional heft, you know, and you want to sort of get the tone of it right, which is why the characters are the children of that time, so they can enter their parents' shoes, you know, or the new migrants today. So they're having the experience today that we're trying to replicate from the 60s. So all that layers in more and more authenticity, you know, and that's why we just try to pile it on, really, you know, as much as we can. So that is so the pictures last the distance. Well, I mean, I'm still like, it's still my impression, you know, so I'll take ownership of that, but I just want to have it, I want it to be right, you know, but still in the end, they're my impressions, they're coming from my psyche, you know, they're my response to the stimulus that I'm gathering from people's testimonies, you know, it's still coming through me. So I you know, I have to own it, you know.
Thank you so much to Billy for talking to us and sharing. Thank you to my glamorous assistant, Kevin. That's it, yeah. Thank you to Mark for the filmmaking, and thanks to Rachel. And thank you to you guys for coming along, because we'd be pretty pointless sat here on our own.
It's an
wouldn't we?
amazing
So
showing.
It's,
Amazing
it's
show.
really fantastic that so many of you turned up and wanted to be part of this, and I hope you're happy.